Well, welcome everyone, and many thanks for joining us. Today we're talking about mapping biodiversity priorities, which, as you can see, is a practical science-based approach to national biodiversity assessment and prioritization. This was a collaborative effort between SANBI, the South Africa National Biodiversity Institute, and the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre. The guidance is published and available, and we'll be sending links to it afterwards. And today we're going to be giving you an overview of the approach, which is very much based on the South African National Biodiversity Assessment experience. So I will just start off giving a little bit of insight into the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre, which from here on in I'll refer to as UNEP-WCMC. Amongst a broad portfolio of work that the Centre has on the development and delivery of biodiversity information and data to inform decision making, UNEP-WCMC seeks to support the delivery of global biodiversity commitments. And as an example of this, we provide support to the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity at global, regional and national levels. And part of our portfolio, in fact, is supporting the revision and implementation of National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, or NBSAPs, as we'll refer to them. UNEP-WCMC, in fact, represents UN Environment as one of the three core or host partners of the NBSAP forum, and through workshops, online support tools, products and services, we seek to support countries to develop and revise and to implement those NBSAPs, which I'm sure most of you know are the principal instruments for implementing the CBD at the national level. So the challenge that we saw, I suppose, really in Decision 10.2 at the 10th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, there was a strategic plan for biodiversity that was adopted, including 20 HE targets, and parties agreed to translate the strategy really into revised and updated national biodiversity strategies and action plans, which was articulated especially in HE Biodiversity Target 17, which states that by 2015 each party has developed, adopted as a policy instrument and commenced implementing an effective participatory and updated NBSAP. In the same decision, parties were also urged to use these revised and updated NBSAPs as effective instruments for the integration of biodiversity targets into spatial planning processes by governments and the private sector at all levels. Spatial data and mapping can provide multiple benefits within an NBSAP, including determining the state of biodiversity in a country, identifying national priorities and visually communicating key biodiversity issues. And anecdotal evidence early on in the process indicated that the revised and updated NBSAPs still had a bit of a dearth, perhaps, of spatial information and data being included. So as part of the NBSAP forum activity, UNEP-WCMC conducted a survey of NBSAP teams in 124 countries to explore their use of spatial data, which revealed that of 20 countries out of the 50 that responded didn't appear to include any spatial data. So there's a clear need to provide ongoing support and guidance to countries with regard to assessing and managing the state of their biodiversity through the use of spatial information. As a starting point, UNEP-WCMC developed some guidance. The link is here, and again we'll find a way to share this and link to it. It is uploaded, in fact, on the NBSAP forum. But this guidance document here, which really supported NBSAP practitioners to identify where spatial data could be included in an NBSAP. Which was very well received, and there was an annex, in fact, which provided links to a whole host of different resources that are available freely online, and the kind of capacity needed in order to be able to use those. But we recognized that the where, whilst it is useful, could be well complemented by the how. which led to a fortuitous meeting of SANBI and UNEP-WCMC, where we recognised that, in fact, SANBI was very advanced in this area, but had started from a point at which there were very few resources available and very little data, and that South Africa, in fact, is asked on a regular basis for support in doing these kinds of spatial assessments, but didn't necessarily have the capacity to answer all of those queries, and was looking for a way to articulate their experiences in a document that would help the wider global community. The starting point for South Africa was the National Spatial Biodiversity Assessment 2004, which had a significant impact on their 2005 NBSAP. So, recognising that this was particularly important to provide guidance appropriate for countries that are resource and data constrained, but also biodiversity rich, we felt that really the key here was to generate a guidance that encapsulated the approach to spatial biodiversity assessment and planning, and distilling it into its most simple elements. And as such, a team convened, in fact, in Stellenbosch in South Africa almost exactly a year ago. This was practitioners who had been heavily involved in early and current national spatial biodiversity assessments. And we brought this team together with significant expertise to define the essential components for conducting spatial biodiversity assessment. And the result is indeed this Mapping Biodiversity Priorities Guidance, which was launched at South Africa's 13th National Biodiversity Planning Forum in June 2016. We're expecting the guidance will serve as a useful prelude to the publication of incorporating and utilising spatial data and mapping for NBSAPs, since it shows how it is possible to use available spatial data to conduct a useful national assessment of biodiversity in a short space of time and with minimal resources. And at this point, I'm in fact going to hand over to Mandy Driver, who really was a key person in driving forward this process and was heavily involved in the previous South African National Biodiversity Assessments. Mandy.
Great, thanks, John. Am I online and clear?
I can hear you well, thank you.
Good. Okay, so first let me just say that it's really been a pleasure for us at SANBI and our colleagues in the biodiversity planning sector in South Africa to work with WCMC on putting this guidance together. And what I'm going to do today is just give you a quick overview of the guidance. John, can you move to the next slide? Great. So I'll talk about some of the key questions that frame the guidance as a whole and some guiding principles. And then Stephen Holness is going to take over and talk about the more technical issues, the data sets and the steps for assessment and prioritization. And then I'll come back in on products and some more principles and enabling factors. Part of the premise of the approach that we've set out in the Mapping Biodiversity Priorities book is that in any country and in almost any policy context, there are some fundamental questions that we need to answer to guide biodiversity strategy and action planning. The first of them is, what biodiversity does the country have and where is it located? So in other words, where is it geographically in the landscape and seascape? And I want to mention here that when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about all three components of biodiversity: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. So we're not only referring to the species part of that. And of those three components of biodiversity, it's often actually simplest to map diversity at the ecosystem level. So we often use ecosystem types as the foundation for answering that first question about what biodiversity do we have. But we can also look at elements like what species of special concern occur in the country and what ecological processes are important for persistence of biodiversity. So that's question one. Then question two is, what's the state of that biodiversity across the landscape and seascape? And we need to get a picture of how biodiversity is doing in different parts of the country, what much of it is still intact, what the key pressures are that are being experienced, and how much of each ecosystem type and species is protected. And ideally, we want to track that over time. And then the third fundamental question is, where and how should we be acting first to manage and conserve our country's biodiversity? We know that resources are almost always constrained, and most countries have to make tough choices about where to focus limited resources for most benefit. So answering that question helps us to guide strategically what are the most important and most urgent geographic areas for a range of different interventions to conserve and manage biodiversity. Right, so what we're going to do today is take you through how the Mapping Biodiversity Priorities approach helps answer those three questions. Gathering the essential data sets helps to answer the first question about what biodiversity do we have and where is it. And then combining those essential data sets in a spatial assessment gives us two headline indicators that help to tell us how biodiversity is doing. And those are especially useful for monitoring and reporting on the state of biodiversity over time. And then the third question is answered through a prioritization process where we can end up with this whole series of maps to guide conservation action. In South Africa, we quite often talk about the three-way action plan. So we want to avoid further loss of natural habitat in priority areas. We also want to expand our formal protected area network, and then in some cases we need to restore degraded ecosystems. And the maps from the prioritization can guide all three of those different types of actions. So that gives you a quick overview of how the approach that we're going to present responds to the three key questions. And Stephen will say quite a bit more about that. Okay, so then moving on to the guiding principles. The whole approach is based strongly on the well-known principles of systematic conservation planning. These were developed initially in Australia, and they were formalized in a Margles and Pressey paper titled Systematic Conservation Planning that was published in Nature in 2000, so a while ago. And since then, systematic conservation planning, the approach has been applied in many parts of the world, and we're certainly not claiming that this approach is South African. But what we can say is that systematic conservation planning has been particularly enthusiastically adopted in South Africa, and it's become firmly embedded in the practice of our biodiversity sector over the last 15 years, and it's also actually firmly embedded in government legislation and policy. So the first principle is that we want to conserve a representative sample of every type of biodiversity, known as the principle of representation. We know that historically, in many countries, there's often been a bias towards conserving some species, often charismatic species, and towards placing protected areas in places where we happen to have few competing land uses, so it's relatively easy to establish a protected area. And what that means is that only certain species and certain ecosystem types end up being protected. This principle of representation is about ensuring that a viable sample of every species and every ecosystem type is protected or at least managed for conservation in some way. Then the second principle is to conserve the key ecological processes that are essential for ensuring that those ecosystems and species persist over time. And that might include, for example, identifying ecological corridors that allow for species movement and connectivity in the landscape and making sure that those stay intact. So that's the principle of persistence. And then the third principle is to set quantitative biodiversity targets that guide how much biodiversity should be conserved. It's all very well to say we want to represent all species of ecosystems and species, but we need to know how much of the landscape or seascape do we need to manage for biodiversity to those goals. Those targets also can be used to evaluate the success or the impact of our conservation actions. And they underpin the assessment and prioritization process. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Stephen, who's going to say more about how we put these principles into practice using the biodiversity approach.
Excellent. Thanks, Mandy. Can you hear me? Just a confirmation from Mandy or John?
Yes.
Cool. Excellent. Thanks. Okay, so I think what we need to put on the table is that this whole process of being systematic about your assessments can be very complicated and very scary. And a key point of what we're putting on the table is that it actually doesn't need to be. So essentially what we're doing is stripping down the process to as basic a combination of inputs as is possible. At its barest, what we're doing is using 4 essential data sets to build up these assessments and then some spatial prioritization, and I'll go through that quickly now. So the 4 essential data sets that we're looking at are a map of ecosystem types, a map of ecological condition, a map of protected areas, and then the 4th input is the set of targets. And we'll look at each of those in turn. John, if you can go on to the next slide. Cool, so the first is a map of ecosystem types. So I'm going to be using a single example throughout this presentation. The one I'm using is for the Arabian Peninsula and the United Arab Emirates, where we applied this essentially the South African methodology quite directly. So we need a map of ecosystem types. There are a couple of things that are very helpful to bear in mind when one is putting this map of types together. The first is that we actually do need to make sure that the map covers the whole country or region. So you don't want a map of a little portion of your country or area of interest. A second point is that it needs to show the full historical extent of each ecosystem type. So we really want to get an idea of where these ecosystems broadly were before there was any large-scale change linked to human intervention. Other things that are useful is that you typically have some sort of a sensible classification system. Often this is hierarchical, and you need to show ecologically meaningful units on your map. In an ideal world, you'll also be covering both marine and terrestrial habitats, so you'd be covering all realms in your ecosystem map, but this doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and just starting with, say, a terrestrial map is a good place to start. John, if we can go on to the next one. Okay, so here is a slightly more zoomed in version of an ecosystem map. This is the UAE. It's an example of a map. The blue colors are marine and coastal ecosystems. All of the other colors are terrestrial types. We built this map up from soils, topography, some existing veg maps in particular areas, a pretty good marine map that existed, and then some expert inputs. A fair amount of effort went into building this map of ecosystems. But it's such an important building block of all the work one's doing that it really is worthwhile getting this right. John, if we can go to the next slide. The second issue that we need to get a decent map of is of ecological condition. And basically this is a map that's showing how modified your landscape or seascape is. You would want to indicate on this the range of conditions from natural or semi-natural sites to those that have been severely impacted or even completely lost. The purpose of this ecological condition map is to show the amount and location of natural habitat that remains available for achieving targets. And I think a key important to highlight here is that although you can do this in either a really simple way, linked directly to something like a land cover in a terrestrial sense, or you can build it up in a very intensive and complicated way, bringing together land cover, changes in fresh water, alien species, and all sorts of other pressures and impacts. At the end of it, what we need to do is get a single map of ecological condition. So we want to combine the information of impact from different drivers of ecosystem change into a single map. John, if you can go on to the next slide, we've got an example of this. Okay, so here is an example of a condition map from the UAE again. basically on this, the dark brown colors in the marine area are areas in poor condition. So these are highly impacted areas with oil extraction or intense fisheries. On the terrestrial side, the very dark colors are areas that are highly impacted by particularly urban expansion and so on. So this is an example of a sort of product that we'd want to develop. John, the next slide. The third key building block of the process is that we need to have a decent map of protected areas. This is probably the most simple of the input layers, but it is really important. And so here we're wanting to show the areas of land or sea that are formally protected by legal means or by other effective means and that are managed mostly for conservation. We need to show where the protected areas are, where their boundaries are. This can be quite a simple process, but typically you'd have to be making decisions in this process about what you include and what you don't include. And basically the point is whether a protected area is contributing to meeting biodiversity targets in the analysis. Typically we would be limiting our assessment to areas with secure formal legal status. But it might be appropriate to use a different range of protected areas in different areas. We would often link this to the different categories of IUCN protection. There are other subtleties here that I won't go into, such as, for example, only counting intact areas as meeting targets, but that's a bit of nuance that we don't need to deal with now. John, if you can go on. Okay, so the fourth major building block of this systematic approach, and it's the one that separates it from many of the other similar spatial approaches, is that we need to set targets. Biodiversity targets are absolutely critical and fundamental building block of this approach. They set out what the minimum portion of each ecosystem type is that needs to be kept in a natural or semi-natural state in the long term to ensure that system remains viable and that most of the species associated with it are retained. We need to set our targets for each ecosystem type. We can do this in a really intensive way or quite quickly. In an ideal world, one would be setting targets based on ecological characteristics. You'd be setting higher targets for your special systems and lower targets for the less special, less diverse, less heterogeneous ones. You might be using things like species area curves or occupancy models or any of a whole range of methods for setting these targets. But pragmatically, you might have to start at a more basic level initially. So you might have insufficient data to use targets based on ecological characteristics. If this is the case, there are easier options. So for example, you can use a fixed percentage target, say 20% of the extent of an ecosystem. This is one that lines up very well with the current IUCN red listing process for ecosystems. Alternatively, you could use a fixed percentage with a minimum, so you might say 20%, but never less than 10,000 hectares, or you might set your targets based on something political, like say the 17% HE target for terrestrial systems. John, next slide please. Then once we've got those four building blocks, there are a couple of ways in which we can combine them. The first of these is to look at ecosystem threat status. For this, we are bringing together our ecosystem types, our biodiversity targets, and our ecological condition. And then the second is ecosystem protection level, where we bring the ecosystem types, the targets, and our protected area map together. Next slide, please. Okay, so the primer goes through the process of how we can do these two assessments. John, just go on to the next slide. So the first of these is assessing ecosystem threat status. To do this, we would map and classify our ecosystems. So we take that ecosystem map that I showed you. We'll set our targets for each of the ecosystems on the map. We'll map our ecological condition in the third step. We will then evaluate what portion of each ecosystem type is still in good ecological condition, and essentially evaluate these in step 5 against thresholds to assign categories. John, next slide. The categories that I'm showing in this slide are ones that we use and we find very convenient for us. There's nothing particularly special about these categories that we're using here. They just happen to be ones that are ones that work for us and we found helpful. These ones also link quite well through to the IUCN Red List categories and are things that are quite easy and intuitive for species people to understand. So it's something that doesn't take a lot of explaining. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it is limited, but essentially what we do is that we'd set out a number of thresholds. The ones we typically use are if you're less than target, let's say the target was 25%, you'd be critically endangered. If you're within 15% of that target, you'd be endangered. If less than 60% is remaining intact, you'd be vulnerable. If more than 60% is intact, you'd be least threatened. A nuance on this approach is that typically for the critically endangered and endangered thresholds, we would be looking at only evaluating the areas that were in really good intact condition. And for the vulnerable and least threatened, we would evaluate good and fair condition areas. John, if we can go on to the map. If we do that, we can produce a very quick map that shows the threat status of our different ecosystems. This provides a very quick and informative map highlighting problem areas. So in this case, in the UAE, there was a whole lot of issues along the coast and inshore systems, but very informatively it identified some problems in the inland, which are those red critically endangered types, which are some gravel plains that had previously not been recognized because people thought they were boring and a bit unexciting. So this quite quick assessment allowed us to quickly identify where there were problem areas. John, the next slide, please. So a second area that we can do, it's also a quick analysis, is of ecosystem protection level. Next slide. And here what we do is, again, we take our ecosystem map, which is step 1. We take our targets. We take our map of existing protected areas, and essentially all that we do is determine the proportion of each ecosystem type that is included in the existing protected area network and evaluate this against the targets. Next slide. Similar to the ecosystem threat status, we use a number of thresholds and criteria to make our assessment easier to understand. Again, there's nothing special about the categories that we're using on this map, but they're ones that work for us. And typically the ones we're using show a range from not protected, where we've got 0 or less than 5% of the targets met in protected areas, through to well protected, where the full target is met in protected areas. John, the next slide. Here's the example of the results of the assessment for the UAE. The dark green colors are ecosystems that are well protected. The light colors are places that aren't well protected or not protected at all. And again, very quickly we get a picture of the different types that are actually quite well covered by protected areas and systems that are very poorly covered. Next slide, please. So once we've done those assessments, which are the real basic building blocks of what we're trying to do, we can move on to prioritization. These prioritizations can be for planning and decision making, or for things like protected area expansion. John, next slide. Again, it's possible to do things very quickly or in far more depth. For a basic prioritization, we'd literally just combine our ecosystem threat status and protection level to show combinations of highly threatened and poorly protected ecosystems. This in itself is an extremely powerful message for NBSAPs, and it's particularly powerful when combined with condition to show only the remaining intact portions of these very high priority systems. Next slide, please. So if we want to do a fuller prioritization, this really can be as complicated as we want to make it. Typically, in addition to the things that we've already discussed, we'd add in things like key species, all sorts of mapping of ecological processes and corridors and so on. And then very importantly, we'd also be looking at the range of social, political, and economic drivers of what's going on, and that's in a basket of things that I'm calling opportunities and constraints. John, next slide. Just to quickly go through the steps, I'm watching the time. Here we would map and classify our ecosystems. We'd set our targets for our ecosystem types and all the other biodiversity features that we're including. So this would be the species, ecological processes, ecological infrastructure, ecosystem services, whatever was relevant. We'd essentially evaluate how much we've already protected, and then in step 4, identify priority areas to deal with anything that is missing from our current network. We'd build into here the examination of constraints, so say avoiding conflicting land uses, and opportunities. We'd often be using something like MarkSan or CPlan or some other technology like that to do this. That would allow us to identify appropriate areas for conservation actions and to then build this into products, which Mandy will deal with in a minute. Next slide, please. So we really don't have time to go into any great detail on this process, but basically what we're aiming for is a portfolio of sites that collectively meet our biodiversity targets. The sorts of things that we're trying to do in this process is ensure complementarity, so that the things that are represented in one area are not duplicated. We try to be as efficient as possible, so we want to meet our targets in a way that doesn't require more area and is not and avoids conflict wherever possible. We'd also be wanting to make sure this is in some ecologically sensible and connected configuration. John, next slide, please. So there's all sorts of different flavors of prioritization that one can do. I've just got a couple of different examples on the screen which show some prioritizations at an international, a provincial, and a state level. This would vary according to what your scale and purpose of your product was. So I'm going to hand back over to Mandy to deal with the products. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Right, so picking up from there, as Stephen's explained, applying the approach that we've presented in the book results in a range of products. Perhaps first and foremost are the map products. And the products include not only the threat status and protection level and the priority areas, but the essential data layers themselves are actually also often important products. So a map of ecosystem types, maps of protected areas can be very useful in their own right. And then the threat status, protection level, and maps of biodiversity priority areas can be used to inform a wide range of planning and decision making and implementation, definitely in the biodiversity sector, but also in other sectors whose activities impact on biodiversity. And what we've done in section 7 of the guidance is to give a bit more detail and some lessons on how to present the map products in a way that helps to make them user-friendly for uptake by a range of non-technical experts. One of those lessons, and this is something that I feel quite strongly about, is to pay very close attention to the legends of the maps, the color and the design of the map products. And on a practical note, it's quite important if you're doing an assessment or prioritization project to make sure that there's enough time towards the end of the project for that, because things can often get quite rushed. And what you don't want to end up doing is just putting out raw products that haven't been thought through. Another lesson is to provide guidelines or manuals for using the maps aimed at non-technical users. And again, this takes a bit of time to put together, but it actually dramatically enhances the usefulness of the map. So each map should have a clear message or a clear so what implication that's linked to the map. For example, for your map of threatened ecosystems, your so what message might be avoid further loss of natural habitat in those critically endangered and endangered ecosystem types. The spatial datasets that lie behind the maps are also a major product, and if possible, it's useful to make those available online, as it helps the users of the maps. And then one obviously wants a technical report that sets out the data and the methods in some detail. It's important that that needs to be separate from the guidelines or the implementation manuals. We made some mistakes in early projects of putting the guidelines and the technical stuff all together in one document, and generally that's not a good idea. And then one also might want to produce a high-level summary report that's got the key maps and findings and messages in a format that's aimed at policymakers. Next slide, please, John. The approach is summarized in the front, on the inside front cover of the guidance. There's a kind of quick reference summary of the approach at a glance, which is what you're seeing here. It goes through all the steps that Stephen has talked us through. Next slide, please. Just to wrap up, I'm going to go through some of the additional principles and then some enabling factors. So in addition to those 3 principles of systematic conservation planning that we talked about earlier, there are 7 additional principles that we've distilled from our experience over the last several years. I'm not going to discuss them all now. They are in section 3 of the guidance. But one that I want to highlight is number 6, start simply and plan for iterative improvements. The first time this approach is applied in a country, there's probably going to be significant data gaps and significant capacity constraints, and the outputs might seem far from perfect. And this was certainly the case with our first national biodiversity assessment in South Africa in 2004. But what we would strongly recommend is that it's better to start with something simple rather than postpone in the hope of getting more optimal data and more capacity to do a sophisticated assessment at some future date. And what we found is that the process of undertaking that initial simple assessment helped to demonstrate that the products were feasible and useful. And it also highlighted the key data gaps. And that in itself can create the impetus to fill the data gaps and mobilize effort and enthusiasm in the biodiversity sector for improving data and capacity for the next iteration. Okay, and then last slide, just to look at some enabling factors that are useful for conducting, can help a great deal with conducting a national biodiversity assessment and prioritization in the way that we've described. The first one is the existence of an agency that can coordinate the assessment or prioritization project. In an ideal world, it's great to have a national government department or an agency that's got a formal mandate to conduct biodiversity assessment or monitoring. But if there isn't such an agency, or if that's not possible, another organized government department could play the role, and it's also possible for an NGO to play the coordination role, especially if it works in close collaboration with the relevant government structures. It's likely that a team of people will be needed to undertake the assessment or prioritization, and those people need not all be based in the coordinating agency. So it's useful to have a project coordinator in the coordination agency who can pull together a technical team, which could include people based in various organizations. It could also include independent consultants. That coordinator should preferably have the project as one of their core parts of their job description, and their role would also include ensuring that relevant stakeholders are involved. And we've said some more about involving stakeholders in the guidance itself. The second factor is to establish a community of practice on biodiversity assessment and planning that can bring together practitioners and to share lessons and progress. In South Africa, we have a National Biodiversity Planning Forum that plays that role. It's grown now to about 200 participants, and over the last 12 years it meets annually. But it started quite small with around 30 participants at the first meeting in 2004. So yeah, one doesn't need to go big initially. And it's also useful if that agency that's coordinating the assessment and prioritization project can convene the community of practice. And then our last enabling factor is about ensuring that the biodiversity assessment and prioritization is aligned with national priorities and with existing government processes as much as possible. An example here would be to link assessment to the process of revising or implementing the NBSAP. Initially, the focus might be on aligning with national priorities and processes within the environmental sector, but as the products of the assessment are shown to be useful, there may be opportunities to make links with policies and processes in other government departments and other sectors, particularly those that are involved in natural resource management. So we're thinking of departments of water affairs or agriculture, for example. And what we found is that the products of a spatial biodiversity assessment or prioritization are powerful mainstreaming tools for proactively making links with some of those other sectors and policy processes. And then our last slide is just a reminder of where you can download the guidance. And John, I think back over to you.
Right. Well, many thanks indeed, Stephen and Mandy. Diego, perhaps you might be able to advise us on next steps, whether there is an opportunity for any discussion at this point.
Sure. I just want to invite the participants to raise your hand in the control panel, so we will be able to unmute your microphone. You also can send your question by reading down in the questions tab. So I just invite the participants to do it. I have several hands raised, so I'm going to open the microphone of John Mauremutu. John, can you hear us? Yep. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, I didn't join you for the first stage of this, but I was just wondering if you could give a ballpark figure for the kind of portion of countries who are involved in biodiversity mapping in terms of their NBSAPs, so they're using it actively to plan their NBSAPs.
So John, welcome, and good to have you on the webinar. What we don't have is a complete data set. Between UNDP and the UN Environment, I think we've now reviewed somewhere in the region of 60 draft NBSAPs prior to submission. We did a survey of countries last year, which was a self-assessment of how much spatial data and information was included within their NBSAP. And it was, and about 20 out of the 50 responses we received didn't appear to include any spatial data in their updated NBSAP. I have to say that in some more recent analysis that we've been doing in order to inform our reporting to the GEF, it looks more like something like 3/4 of those that we've reviewed have some form of spatial data. But obviously that could be in any form. It doesn't necessarily need to be a map. It could simply be describing a spatial component of biodiversity. That's the quick answer, John. I mean, we could always discuss a little bit more offline, but I hope that gives you some idea.
Well, you've not been able to as yet sort of get that a bit more fine-grained in terms of the quality of the mapping.
No, we haven't. You may be aware that not all of the 194 parties to the CBD have actually submitted their NBSAPs quite yet, although that should, it won't be long before the vast majority of them have. I know that the Secretariat have also been doing some analysis as those NBSAPs come in, which has previously been presented in information documents to CBD meetings. So I could try to dig something out and ask around if you're interested in finding out finer detail.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm going to open microphone for Laura Rodriguez. Laura, are you there? Can you unmute your microphone, please? Okay, I'm going to pass to another question. Hold on, please. Thierry de Oliveira, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here. Can
Okay,
you hear
go
me?
ahead. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead with your question, please.
Well, first of all, sorry, I just took your presentations on the way, but very interested. I'm an economist in UNEP. We're actually also doing some work in South Africa, but for water accounting. When the presenter was bringing a very important point, which is that assessments align with government national priorities. And what we found is, first of all, in terms of the mapping, in terms of spatial mapping is very important. But also what we're interested in, I want to get your take on this, is we really want to see what's going on, the transactions, if you will, that going on under the map. And we found out that it's really like one of the most important way to get into national priorities, whether it's budgeting processes or national development plans or talking with the Bureau of Statistics. And us in UNEP here, we are getting really busy in terms of trying to construct this type of data set, if you want, and linking the spatial data, but also with all the transactional economic data. I don't know, my question is, how far are you to address these issues, especially all these socioeconomic data linked to the physical data and mapping? Thank you.
Diego, I'm not sure if I should respond to that or Stephen.
Mandy, you go first, and if there's anything to add. Yeah.
Well, maybe Stephen can talk a little bit more about how we've incorporated socioeconomic data into spatial biodiversity prioritization. I think, as Stephen mentioned in his presentation, there are many, many ways to do that. So it's something we've explored quite a lot. What I think might be interesting just to mention is that, sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person asking the question, but you mentioned Thierry, you mentioned water accounting.
Yes.
And what we are in the process of doing in South Africa is using some of the spatial data that's gone into our national biodiversity assessment to do ecosystem counts. So we're very much thinking about how one presents some of that information in a way that speaks to a broader range of sectors, and we're working with our National Statistics Office on that, and that is something that we're looking to pursue further.
Great. Yeah.
Should I say something about the socioeconomic data in the prioritization?
Are you asking me?
I think so.
No, yeah, okay. So I mean, just the sorts of things that we would include in a spatial prioritization, if that was what we were interested in that assessment, would, you know, for example, recent ones have included levels of direct dependency on ecosystem services from the natural environment. We've had assessments that have had a heavy link to poverty, use of natural resources. A big important theme that's developing in South Africa and elsewhere at the moment is the whole concept of ecological infrastructure, where we're focusing not so much on ecosystem services, but on the areas that are delivering those ecosystem services to people. And so we're particularly interested in, say, areas important for securing water supply or reducing flood risk and things like that. So I think for South Africa, we're very much in a developmental state, and we realize that our biodiversity information is great, but it's weakened if one doesn't have a direct link to society, the economics, people, and benefits derived from it. So we're putting a lot of effort in making that link to the sort of socio and economic spheres.
Right.
Can I maybe just add one thing to that, which is that adding in all of those socioeconomic links is built on the foundation of having those essential data sets of ecosystem types and ecological condition. So they very much go hand in hand.
Yeah, and I would actually like to add add something to your addition, is that we've deliberately kept the basic assessment stuff as simple as possible. So although in the spatial prioritization we bring in as broad a range of, let's call it, other social and economic issues as is necessary for the spatial prioritization, for the actual assessments, we're deliberately keeping it brutally simple. And this has actually been very beneficial to us and has allowed us to get a message that people understand, get it on the table, whereas I suspect that if we got too complex early on, we'd have struggled to get a picture on the table.
Right. Very good.
Thank you. Okay, we have several questions related to where the presentation is available. I just wanted to say that the presentation and the recording will be shared through our NBSAP forum, www.nbsapforum.net. So please stay tuned on that. I'm going to open the microphone to Inés Machado. Inés, are you there? Inés? Inés, can you hear us? Hello? Well, it seems we are having some issues with the microphone. So I'm going to open the microphone to Mahub Raham. Mahub, can you hear us?
Yep.
Go ahead with your question.
Yeah. My question, actually, I posted that one.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, the second question. How do NBSAPs are, when submitted to CBD, analyzed by them, and do they provide any feedback on the NBSAPs sent from the countries, different countries?
Thank you. So there is a mechanism through the NBSAP forum, as I mentioned, that's co-hosted by the United Nations Development Programme, UN Environment, and the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in fact, through the NBSAP forum, there's a mechanism to offer voluntary peer review of draft NBSAPs. So if you're in that position where you have a draft NBSAP product, and would like to seek some review, then please do get in touch either through the NBSAP forum or directly with Christina Suppers, who is online, or myself, and we can point you in the right direction. In terms of CBD analysis, as I mentioned, I have to say I'm not totally clear on the intricacies of exactly how that works, but they have presented their results in information documents that have accompanied some of the CBD meetings. And again, that's something that I could dig out the latest version or contact colleagues to ensure that we share that.
Thank you, John. I'm going to read a question from Anico Polo. I'm going to open the microphone anyway, but the question is, where and how is integrated the human dimension in these 4 essential data sets? And Anico, your microphone is open.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello? Hello?
Yes?
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much. And here in Togo, I'm currently in Togo, and here in Togo, the problem with protected area is mostly with the local communities. And usually there is some kind of conflicting situation between protected managers and local communities. Then, seeing the data set that are useful to map the priorities of or the priority area of biodiversity conservation, I'd like to know where to put the assessment of the human dimension, because most of the local communities are living upon the natural resources. They need natural resources for most of their livelihoods. And then I would like to know if we can maybe include that in this mapping. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Should I respond to that?
Yeah, go for it, Stephen.
Okay. So I think the first thing to say is that in those basic input layers to the mapping process, typically in the condition mapping, we will have often quite intensive interrogation of human activities and the consequences that those activities might have on the condition of an environment. So whether that is deforestation or fisheries or urban development or whatever that is. So in that condition map, there would generally be quite intensive mapping of human utilization of landscapes. Okay, so that's the one place where we'd definitely be incorporating this human dimension. The second major area, though, is when we do the spatial prioritization. And in that spatial prioritization, you might want to be using all sorts of human-related issues. So you'd be using that basic biophysical data as almost the context for your further interrogation of the landscape. And this falls into a basket of things that we would typically call opportunities and constraints. The opportunities side might be places where there are existing conservation actions, or if there are compatible land uses that link in well to conservation activities. And then constraints might be places where there are things like intense land use pressures, maybe where land has been identified for some sort of other development, maybe an industrial development zone, or for smallholder agriculture, or or whatever that other activity is. And so when we get into the whole spatial prioritization process, in that you can essentially use as much or as little data on these human dimensions as is appropriate. And so really it's going to depend on the circumstances and the sort of planning that you're wanting to do, and very often that will depend on whether you're planning for things like a national assessment for your NBSAP, or whether you're doing more detailed planning for, say, protected area expansion or land use planning, which might have quite different inputs at quite a finer scale.
Stephen, do you mind if I interject and sort of, in a sense, ask a supplementary question? But my understanding is that the initial assessment stage is very science and data centric, but that actually the products that come out of those can very much be used in a sort of human and stakeholder kind of way. So you might in fact take those products and use them to talk to communities about their use of the landscape as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a totally fair point. And yeah, so we're in no way reducing the value of those human and social inputs into a process. We're just saying that there's a great deal of benefit in having a decent picture of what the basic, let's call it physical situation is, before you go into those broader social interactions. So it's all very well prioritizing your, say, conservation actions based on what is acceptable to communities, but we do want to make sure that we don't just say end up conserving a whole lot more of stuff that's already well conserved in your protected area network, and we don't want to just give up on things that aren't well protected in your protected area network just because they're difficult. And really, I think these assessments give you a very quick picture of places where you actually have to put in more effort, and places where you have to emphasize when you go into these broader integrated planning processes, and it just gives you a decent evidence basis for when you do that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read one of the questions that our participants are sending. Remember that you can send your question through the questions tab in the control panel, or you can raise your hand if you want to talk through the microphone. The next question comes from Benjamin Khan. He says, "Hi, I'm Benjamin Khan here, Director APEX Environmental from Indonesia. Great seminar, thanks for the information. I work on oceanic cetaceans and associated deep-sea habitats in the Coral Triangle, including several highly migratory species, such as blue sperm whales, where mapping often includes a transboundary component. So, two questions here. One, what are the challenges, opportunities for transboundary conservation as this essentially national approach? And two, paradoxically, we often work on provincial, but still very large scale in an archipelago of 18,000 islands. So how best to structure a provincial assessment or priority seascapes that can then still be integrated in a national assessment later on? Thank you for this very relevant webinar. I'm going to open Benjamin's microphone in case he wants to go deep into the question, but go ahead with the answer.
Okay. I think I'm going to jump in there also. So I think the first thing we need to do is separate assessment from planning. So assessments can very easily be done for whatever region you're interested in. Whether that is a subcontinent, like we did that for the Arabian Peninsula across a whole lot of countries, or for a very small area. So you can essentially do an assessment at whatever scale for whatever area is applicable to your problem. However, that's quite different to the planning process. And I think it's really important in a planning process that you do need to be very aware of jurisdictions and authorities. So there really is no point in doing a planning process that doesn't have some link through to specific jurisdictions, whether those are national EEZs or whatever the unit is. and it certainly does make it more difficult. But there are quite a few systematic assessment processes that are that cut across national jurisdictions. Whether that's, and many of those are marine. So there are some good examples of doing this. Usually there'd be some sort of transboundary coordinating entity. So a good example of this would be in large marine ecosystems. Often there are these entities looking after things like, for example, the Benguela large marine ecosystem.
Can I just add briefly there a little bit more on how things work in South Africa, which may or may not be applicable elsewhere. But we tend to do our biodiversity assessment at a national scale. So we have a national biodiversity assessment that is done every more or less 7 years. We did 2004, 2011, another one coming up in 2018. But then the prioritization process, and we use the terms planning and prioritization interchangeably. So the spatial biodiversity prioritization in South Africa generally happens at the provincial level. We have 9 provinces, and each of them have a systematic biodiversity plan that sets out critical biodiversity areas at the provincial level, and that links in with the conservation agencies. You're able to implement those. Yeah, I don't have experience of the transboundary one, but that's just a little reflection on the difference between the assessment and planning at the national and provincial level.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Khaled Sestin from Haiti. But thank you for your presentation about the mapping biodiversity priority. You give more information across the biodiversity, across the world. My question is, what's the situation, the biodiversity across the world by report the objective 11 Haiti? And what's the sector is more impact the biodiversity by region, but I speak French very well, so my English is not good. It's okay? Hi?
Yeah, we can hear your question. Go ahead.
You don't understand me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. John, Stephen, Mandy?
Stefan.
So the question, sorry, is essentially around how to treat migratory species. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, things obviously do get quite difficult when you are dealing with migratory species, but often we try and keep this simple. So, for example, we'd often build in the particular places that were, say, important for breeding, say colonies of seabirds and things like that, or particular regions that were important for, say, feeding, or actual flyways. So really, what we do is this planning process is very much linked to the ecological requirements of the things that we're planning for. And so basically we would look at the species or groups of species that we were incorporating into our spatial prioritization, look at their requirements, look at the data on the places that were particularly important to them or to particular stages in their life cycle, and try and spatially define that. I think what this does highlight, and it's really important, is that our planning process is very much ecologically led. So it's not a sort of let's call it a GIS-led process. almost all of the people involved, tend to have an ecological or geographical background rather than, say, a technical GIS background. And so we're very cognizant of that. We're trying to put together a sensible ecological understanding of what the priorities are in a robust way, and often this does require some quite subtle bits of information and inputs from different biodiversity specialists to help understand what the spatial priorities are, and hence understand what features we need to include into our prioritization.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Holness. I have a question, a written question. I'm going to read it from Mahbub Rahman. He or she says, in the mapping process, do you consider all the species in a given area, or suggested a system-based approach with targeting some of the critical species? I'm going to open Mahbub's microphone, but I'm not sure he or she can. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was correct.
I asked this question.
Go ahead, please.
Can I add with? I asked this question actually while mapping area. It is most often it is difficult or time-consuming to consider all these species. So, for a system-based conservation approach, if we can target some of the critical species and then the system is maintained, how do you think about it?
Yeah. Okay. Let me respond to that. Yeah. So in South Africa, I mean, because certain systems are so biodiverse, we actually have to even go further than that and start with the ecosystems. So some habitats have got so many different threatened species, many of which that we know very little about in detail, that we actually start with dealing with ecosystems as being representative of many of the underlying species associated with them. And then when we move on to species, we are almost always just dealing with either keystone species or umbrella species or a short list of threatened species. So often we'd be limiting our assessment to, say, threatened and endemic species and maybe a few keystone species. We'd almost never be capable of having full knowledge of all species, or even all the threatened species. So we're always limited by that. But a strength of this sort of approach, by taking an ecosystem lead on it, is that ecosystem serves as a good coarse filter for what's going on in the environment, and then it becomes less important to know all the details of every underlying species.
Yeah, that's what I believe also. I mean, it's difficult to address all these species and then to go for conservation.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the answer, and I believe the concept is same with my one also. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. We have another raised hand by Anna Wolf. Anna, your microphone is open. Can you hear us?
Yeah, hello.
Go ahead.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
I have a question about the presentation. In the part of the presentation of the datasets, the map of the ecological condition, there was a different classification for the terrestrial and the marine area. Maybe you can explain why there's a different classification.
Yeah, okay, no, that's a great question. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't have had a different classification. But we actually, in that process, we struggled to get two very strong teams of scientists to agree on terminology. And so our terrestrial people were comfortable with one set of wording, and our marine people were completely unhappy with that wording. So that was definitely not ideal. In our South African assessments, we've tried to have a single set of terminology, and we've moved to this good, fair, poor, and some subdivisions of that to keep it simpler and neater. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that comment is that although we were forced to use different words in the marine and terrestrial sense in that mapping, the actual concept was exactly the same, so that we could treat the things in the same way. So the three categories were completely they're essentially identical. We just couldn't get people to agree, basically.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Holness. I'm going to read another question from Ann Al-Samarari. It's related to the question from the Indonesian participant. The UNEP-WCMC Secretariat, a specialized partner to CBD on issues on migratory species conservation, has developed guidelines for transboundary conservation implementation in relation to NBSAPs. Next question comes from Iwan Kurniawan. Thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting and inspired us to do NBSAP monitoring and reporting the progress of targets achievement. Question: how do you address inconsistency data and lack of data availability in producing the map? It was the challenges in providing a spatial analysis as reference to develop national targets.
Yeah. Okay. It sounds like these targets are the questions are mostly coming to me. So I'll go with this one as well. So we've always found that it's worth investing in that ecosystem map. So it's not necessarily easy, but it's always been worthwhile. And so even in the most unstudied areas, we've tended to be able to use often sort of proxies for true veg maps or true ecosystem maps to develop something sensible. So you might have a soil map, or you might have some botanists who've mapped part of an area, and very often we'd start with, in a process, we'd have a stock take of what we actually know about different parts of the landscape, and go through some sort of an expert mapping process where we have gaps. So this is often not the easiest activity, but it's always worthwhile to try and get that integrated map of ecosystems. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read another question from our participants. Remember that you can send a question through the questions tab in your control panel, or raise your hand and then we can unmute your microphone. Next question. My name is Harrison from Madagascar. Many thanks for the webinar. I have two questions. One, we just start now the process of red list of ecosystem assessment. Do you think the mapping of biodiversity is not complete without the result of it? And the second one is, we have used the key biodiversity areas for prioritizing sites for conservation in Madagascar, not using Marxan. Do you think it will be okay?
Okay. Mandy, do you want to have a go, or should I have a go on the KBA one first?
I think you have a go, Stephen, on the KBA one.
So I think the first thing to say is that the IUCN red listing process for ecosystems is very aligned with what we're putting on the table here. This is just a slightly streamlined version of that, and obviously it's been going for a lot longer than that IUCN red list system has been. I think what you will find is that there's quite a lot of difficult detail in that IUCN Red List system, and you might be best off using the subset of it. So I think this one linked to criterion A effectively, and it gives you a quite nice quick assessment of what's going on. In terms of KBAs, yeah, so South Africa's not we tend to not have been a great fan of KBAs just because so much of highly biodiverse areas, and I'm sure it's the same for Madagascar, trigger KBA status. So if you have a comprehensive set of KBAs, often that covers pretty much every remaining piece of natural habitat. And so we've tended to find that you actually need to do quite a lot of refinement after that to develop a suitable subset of priorities that you can take forward into your implementation. What we have found KBAs extremely useful for, and this would also include some of the underlying different kinds of KBAs like important bird areas and things like that, is as an input into our spatial prioritization process. So we would often be using identified KBAs as a feature in our spatial prioritization. And so instead of the KBA being the final output, we're using it as an input into an integrated prioritization. And I think that that's probably would be very helpful in a place like Madagascar when there's just too much biodiversity of too many kinds, and you end up with actually just too many KBAs, and you've got to do a bit of prioritization within them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iwan. We have just 7 minutes to finish the webinar, so please send me your questions. I have a couple of questions from Iwan Kurniawan. I'm going to open the microphone, but I'm going to read it. Hold on 1 second. Okay, the first one is thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting and inspired us to do NBSAP monitoring and reporting the progress. I'm sorry, this one. Okay, on a species density map, did you anticipate the information will be used to prioritize hunting area by a legal wildlife hunter?
Okay, so I just need to try and understand that question. So is it asking whether we're worried that someone will use our map in a negative way, or are we talking about us prioritizing actions that sort of try and help solve that problem? I'm just not sure what the angle of the question is. Can they clarify that?
Well, I'm sorry, but I think we lost Iwan Kurniawan because I cannot see the name in the list of participants now. So no, the only information is that on a species density map, did you anticipate the information will be used to prioritize hunting area by a legal wildlife hunter? Okay.
Yeah. So look, I think what I can say there is that once we get into detailed prioritization, what we're using the information for is to clearly understand where priorities are, understand what the threats are to those specific priorities, and then to help identify appropriate management interventions. So the whole important aspect of this whole prioritization process is that you can tailor your response to a particular geographical area, so a place where there is a threat, and you can tailor your response and implementation action to the correct threat. So for example, if the threat there is, say, illegal hunting, you can respond to illegal hunting, and you don't perhaps need to respond to logging. And so just this sort of approach does help you to clearly identify what the specific threats are. Just in case the question was asked from the other angle around, are we worried that our maps of species densities and so on might be used incorrectly? A really important part of our planning process is around transparency. So wherever possible, we are making information that's used in these assessments as available as possible to people. And it's an important part of making these planning processes transparent, repeatable, scientific-based, and generally inclusive and open. But having said that, if there is a particular data layer that is sensitive, so one of the ones that we've had is we've got some really special cycads. These sometimes get targeted by illegal collectors. And in those, sometimes those data sets are not openly shared. So they'll feed into the spatial prioritization process, but we won't necessarily share that that underlying information set. But generally, we would try and share as much of the information as possible, and we would just keep an eye open to make sure it wouldn't be misused.
Thank you very much. We have time just for one question more. I'm going to read it, but I'm going to also open the microphone of Matt Davis. Matt, can you hear us?
I can. Hello.
Can you go ahead with your question, or do you prefer that I read it?
Oh no, that's fine. I can read it. My question is really about the data that goes into the analysis, because it seemed to me, I mean, I commend you on the approach you've taken. It seems really clear, and that it would inform further planning and integration in other mainstreaming. I'm just curious about the data that you've used to underpin the analysis, because there's a really good document, or I thought it was really good, incorporating and using spatial data and mapping for NBSAPs. I was wondering really how much of your approach can be based on data from those kind of global pots, global portals really that are listed in that document, and it does seem like a lot of your analysis is still based on, or needs to be, that maybe those sources need to be complemented by local stakeholder workshops and things like that. So I just wanted to ask you really how much of, whether those global sources, how much of the analysis is based on those and how much on local data.
Yeah, okay. So I think the first thing to say is that if you have not done any sort of spatial analysis before in your country, then you will you'll make enormous advances just by using those global data sets. So utilizing a global map of ecoregions, using available land covers, you can actually, and the protected area layers, you can actually get quite informative picture quite quickly using those data sets. Okay, but having said that, almost always you'll benefit hugely by using better quality national data sets if they are available, and it will almost always be worthwhile putting effort into developing those national data sets if they aren't fully collated. So it's sort of a bit of a two-pronged answer, is that you can get a decent answer on the international data sets, but you will definitely get a far more nuanced and refined answer even on the assessment process, on those two basic assessments, if you're using finer scale data. But I think that the key message is, don't not do it just because you don't have finer scale national data.
Quite, absolutely. And I wonder really whether that might be a good start point really, to just get people on the journey by using what data is available.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But we've actually found that even in some extremely remote and understudied areas, that actually there are often some quite good and underused spatial resources. So even in places like Yemen, Angola, and so on, we've actually managed to dig up quite decent bases. Sometimes they've just been hard copy maps that some I don't know, some German botanist 70 years ago did, but we've put a bit of effort into making them spatial and modern GIS layers, and that effort has always been worthwhile.
That's what I was imagining for the kind of historic distribution of services. I assumed you must have had to do some digitizing from old paper maps.
Yeah, and I mean, what I guess you just want to make sure that the amount of effort you put in is appropriate for what you're using it for. And then just secondarily, I've yet to find a process that hasn't benefited from putting the effort into particularly the ecosystem map. Other bits of the process are easier to be thinner on, but the quality of the ecosystem map is quite central to the whole thing.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much for all the participants. Unfortunately, the time is over, so I would like to invite you all to send the questions through the NBSAP forum, www.nbsapforum.net. I also want to let you know that we will be sending a follow-up email with the presentation and the recording of this webinar, as well as some resources related to the topic. Dr. Holness, Dr. Matt Driver, and John Taylor, thank you very much for assisting this webinar. Not sure if you have final words to finish the webinar. Thank you very much.
Well, I think all I want to say is, thank you to Mandy and Stephen, especially for, for such high quality presentation material, but also to all of the participants that have taken an hour and a half out of their day for listening to what we have to say and for your insightful questions. If there are any further questions, I think we're keen to build a bit of a community practice, and do feel free to get in touch through the NBSAP forum.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you all participate in our webinar in October. Please stay tuned on the information. Thank you very much, and have a nice day or nice night. Bye.